When a child is repeatedly compared to others, something subtle but powerful takes place beneath the surface. Comparison becomes a form of psychological conditioning. The child is not merely being evaluated, they are being taught a rule about existence itself, that worth is not inherent but contingent. Approval arrives only when they surpass someone else, when they resemble an external ideal, or when they outperform a sibling, classmate, or imagined standard. Over time, this creates a quiet but persistent association. To be loved is to be better than. From a psychological perspective, this disrupts the natural development of the self. Instead of experiencing themselves as a subject with intrinsic value, the child learns to view themselves as an object under constant measurement. Jung would say the ego begins to organize itself around adaptation rather than authenticity. The child does not ask, "Who am I?" but "How do I rank?" Life becomes a series of comparisons rather than encounters. This conditioning rarely feels cruel in the moment. It is often framed as motivation or guidance. Yet its deeper effect is existential. It replaces being with proving. And when a person grows up believing they must earn the right to exist, they will spend their life chasing approval instead of meaning. What deserves reflection is this: comparison may shape behavior, but it quietly erodes the soul, and no achievement ever repairs that loss. Once comparison has been established as the measure of worth, it no longer requires an external voice to survive. The child carries it inward. What began as comments from parents, teachers, or peers becomes an internal dialogue that runs quietly but relentlessly. Even in moments of success, the question is not "Did I grow?" but "Was I better than someone else?" And because there will always be someone smarter, faster, or more admired, the verdict is almost always insufficient. Psychologically, this is how inadequacy becomes internalized. The ego adopts comparison as its primary lens, and self-evaluation becomes chronic. Jung understood this as a fragmentation of the psyche, where the persona, the version of the self presented to the world, grows stronger, while the authentic self recedes into the background. The individual learns to distrust their own experience, and instead looks outward for confirmation of value. Praise offers temporary relief, but it never resolves the deeper insecurity because it does not address its source. Over time, this internalized inadequacy shapes ambition, relationships, and even self-talk. Achievements feel hollow, rest feels undeserved, and contentment feels suspicious. The individual is not driven by curiosity or meaning, but by the fear of falling behind. What calls for action is this realization. The voice that tells you you are not enough is learned, and what is learned can be questioned, dismantled, and replaced. When comparison dominates a child's inner world, identity itself becomes unstable. Instead of discovering who they are through curiosity, play, and genuine interest, the child learns to shape themselves around what earns approval. Traits that are praised are exaggerated, traits that are ignored or criticized are suppressed. Slowly, the self becomes a performance. Jung would describe this as an over-identification with the persona, the socially acceptable mask, while the deeper, more instinctive self is pushed into the shadows. This creates a profound confusion. The individual may appear confident, capable, even successful, yet feel strangely disconnected from their own desires. They choose careers, relationships, and values not because these reflect an inner calling, but because they signal competence, status, or superiority. The question, "Who am I?" is replaced by "Who should I be?" And because the answer is always external, it is never stable. Psychologically, this loss of authenticity is costly. Suppressed aspects of the self do not disappear. They return as dissatisfaction, resentment, or a vague sense of emptiness. The person may excel, yet feel unreal while doing so. Life becomes efficient, but not meaningful. The work of healing begins with a difficult but necessary act, turning inward and listening to what was silenced. Because the self you abandoned in order to be accepted is not gone. It is waiting to be reclaimed. When a child grows up under constant comparison, failure takes on a meaning far beyond a simple mistake. It becomes a threat to belonging. The psyche adapts accordingly, and perfectionism emerges not as ambition, but as protection. If being better ensures safety, then being imperfect feels dangerous. Anxiety follows naturally. The child learns to scan for errors, to anticipate judgment, and to stay one step ahead of criticism. What looks like discipline from the outside is often fear on the inside. From a Jungian lens, this reflects an ego caught in continuous defense. The individual becomes identified with achievement as a means of survival, while the shadow fills with everything deemed unacceptable: weakness, uncertainty, rest. Over time, this creates an inner tyranny. Nothing is ever quite enough, because perfection is not a goal that can be reached. It is a condition that must be endlessly maintained. The cost is chronic tension and an inability to tolerate vulnerability. Failure then is no longer instructive, it is catastrophic. It threatens the carefully constructed self-image and revives the original fear of being compared and found lacking. As a result, risk is avoided, creativity is constrained, and growth becomes rigid rather than alive. What deserves reflection is this: perfectionism does not protect your worth. It imprisons it, and only by allowing yourself to be imperfect can you finally be free to grow. The child who learned to understand themselves through comparison does not outgrow this pattern. They carry it into adulthood, where it quietly shapes how they relate to others. Relationships become arenas of evaluation rather than spaces of connection. Affection is often intertwined with performance, and intimacy feels conditional. The adult may seek constant validation, not out of vanity, but out of an old uncertainty about their own worth. Praise soothes, criticism wounds deeply, and neutrality can feel like rejection. Jung would recognize this as a projection of the unresolved self onto others. Because the individual never internalized a stable sense of value, they look to partners, colleagues, and friends to confirm it for them. Comparison persists, now in subtler forms: envy toward others' success, competition where cooperation would suffice, or self-erasure in the attempt to be indispensable. People-pleasing becomes a strategy for safety, while resentment quietly accumulates in the shadow. Professionally, this often manifests as overwork or chronic self-doubt. No accomplishment feels secure enough to silence the inner question of adequacy. Emotionally, it can lead to cycles of closeness and withdrawal, driven by the fear of not measuring up. What calls for action is this insight: relationships can never stabilize a sense of worth that was never claimed within, and the work of healing begins by choosing self-validation over comparison. Again and again, breaking the cycle of comparison requires more than insight. It demands a reorientation of how one relates to the self. The first step is recognizing that worth defined in opposition to others is not worth at all, it is dependence. Jung spoke of individuation as the task of becoming who one truly is, not who one was trained to be. For the child who was always compared, this means slowly withdrawing value from external measures and returning it to inner experience. It is an unfamiliar and often uncomfortable process, because comparison once provided structure, direction, even motivation. Letting it go can feel like losing gravity, yet healing begins precisely there. Self-compassion replaces self-surveillance. Intrinsic motivation emerges where fear once dominated. The individual learns to ask different questions, not "how do I measure up?" but "what feels meaningful, alive, and true for me?" This shift does not eliminate ambition, it transforms it. Action is no longer driven by the need to prove worth, but by the desire to express it. Mistakes become informative rather than humiliating. Growth becomes personal rather than performative. This is not a single decision, but a practice repeated daily, choosing presence over comparison, authenticity over approval. And here lies the final reflection. The moment you stop ranking yourself against others is the moment you begin to stand fully in your own life.